I inherited Dad's junkyard while my brothers got his gold mine and laughed at me. My father's funeral was exactly 1 day ago. The air in Alaska was so cold it felt like grief itself was freezing in your lungs. You know that kind of cold where even breathing hurts? Yeah, that kind. I flew up from San Francisco expecting what you'd expect at a funeral. Silence, shared memories, maybe some tears. Hell, I would have settled for an awkward hug. Instead, I got a business meeting. My older brothers, Mark and David, were waiting for me outside Dad's old house. Not at the cemetery, not at some family gathering. Right there on the gravel driveway, arms crossed, wearing expressions that belonged in a boardroom, not a funeral home. Mark gave me a curt nod. No handshake. No how are you holding up. Just that nod. The lawyer's already inside, Jack. We need to handle the paperwork while you're still in town. While I'm still in town. Like I was some out-of-state investor they needed to pin down before I caught my flight back to civilization. I should have turned around right then. Should have gotten back in my rental car and driven straight to the airport. But grief does weird things to your decision-making. Makes you compliant when you should be cautious. Makes you want to just get through the moment. Consequences be damned. So I followed them inside. The house smelled exactly like I remembered. Old tobacco, metal shavings, that specific scent of diesel fuel that never quite washes out of work clothes. Dad had lived alone here for the past 8 years, ever since Mom passed. The place looked like he'd stopped caring about anything except to mine the day she died. Mark didn't waste time with sentiment. He swept a stack of old mining magazines off the kitchen table and spread out a faded survey map. The paper was so worn at the creases, it was almost transparent. He planted one callous finger on the map, circling a section that included the house, the main processing shed, and the sluice works. This is the main claim. The house, all the equipment, the primary vein where Dad washed gold for 30 years. It's hard work, but it feeds families. Always has. He said it like he was narrating some kind of heritage documentary. Hard work. Feeds families. Noble stuff. But here's the thing about having a data analyst brain. You can't turn it off. While Mark was delivering his speech about family legacy and hard work, my eyes were cataloging everything to the window behind him. The main winch on their processing rig was rusted clean through. I could see daylight through the cable housing. And there, stacked on the porch, was a pile of yellow safety violation notices that nobody had bothered to even open. The envelopes were water-damaged and faded. They weren't working hard. They were squeezing the last drops of value out of Dad's infrastructure and letting it collapse in slow motion, like those guys who buy an apartment building and just collect rent while the pipes burst and the roof caves in. Then Mark's hand moved to a different section of the map. A bigger section, actually. He waved at it dismissively, the way you gesture at a pile of trash you were too lazy to haul to the dump. And this, he said, is the North Ravine. Well, you know what it is. The junkyard. Dad spent 30 years throwing every piece of broken equipment, every load of worthless tailings, every scrap of metal that wasn't worth his time into this gulch. It's basically a landfill with our last name on it. David jumped in then. My middle brother, always playing the role of the reasonable one, the mediator, the guy who pretends to be looking out for everyone while positioning himself to take the biggest slice. Look, Jack, he said, and his tone was so dripping with fake concern it made my skin crawl. We know you're not built for this kind of life. Pickaxes and dirt under your fingernails. You've got your fancy tech job in California, your stock options, your whole different world down there. Mark nodded along like they'd rehearsed this. So here's what we're thinking, David continued. We'll take the main claim, all the debt that comes with it, all the backbreaking work, all the responsibility, and you take the North Ravine. It's a clean asset, no overhead, no maintenance, no headaches. A clean asset, that's what he called it. A literal garbage dump was a clean asset. Mark slid a folder of documents across the table toward me. The papers inside were already marked with yellow sticky tabs everywhere I needed to sign. They prepared this before I even landed. You can probably get a few thousand for the scrap metal, Mark said. Maybe more if you're patient and shop it around. Meanwhile, David and I will be handling all the real work, and you'll get your share without lifting a finger. Easy money, little brother. Easy money. My analytical mind, the same one that had built predictive models for market fluctuations that made my firm millions, was screaming at me, screaming to read every single line of those documents, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture, screaming that nobody offers you easy money without a reason. But the other part of me, the part that was still just a son who'd buried his father 24 hours ago, just wanted to escape, wanted to get out of this house that smelled like loneliness and oil, wanted to get away from my brothers and their calculated kindness that felt more like contempt, wanted to get back on a plane and return to a life that made sense. I would have signed away a kingdom just to end that conversation. So that's exactly what I did. I picked up the pen. It was one of those cheap ballpoints from a bank, probably 20 years old. The ink came out thick and slightly smeared. I signed my name on every yellow tab. Didn't read a word. Just signed and signed and signed. The ink smudged a little on the last signature. Fitting metaphor for the whole dirty business. Mark actually smiled when I pushed the papers back across the table. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile of a guy who just bought something for $1 that he knew was worth 100. David clapped me on the shoulder. Good man, Jack. This way everybody wins. You get liquid capital. We get to continue Dad's legacy. Clean and simple. Clean and simple. Right. I stood up to leave. I couldn't be in that house for another second. Couldn't breathe the same air as these two sharks in flannel shirts. Couldn't stand the weight of what I'd just done, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. I was almost out the door when Mark called after me. Oh, almost forgot. He disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a dust-covered cardboard box, the kind that photocopier paper comes in. He dropped it into my arms with a thud. Dad's journals. He wrote in these things every single night for 30 years, documented every ounce of gold, every breakdown, every random thought that crossed his mind. Figured you might want them. You know, since you're the sentimental type. He grinned. David chuckled. Maybe you can read about exactly how many rusty bolts you officially own now. They both laughed at that. A real hearty laugh. The kind of laugh men share when they think they've pulled off something clever. I took the box without saying a word. It was heavier than I expected. The cardboard was soft with age and moisture, threatening to split at the bottom. I carried it to my rental car in silence. As I loaded the box into the passenger seat, I could hear them inside the house. Their voices carried through the thin walls. More laughter. The pop and hiss of beer cans opening. They were celebrating. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, my hands on the steering wheel, staring at that box of journals. My father had been a man of few words in life. Gruff, practical, showed love through actions, not speeches. The idea that he'd written something every single day for 30 years felt almost impossible, like discovering your quiet uncle had been secretly writing poetry. What could possibly be in those pages? I turned the key. The rental car's engine hummed to life, so quiet compared to every vehicle Dad had ever owned. Everything he drove sounded like it was held together with duct tape and prayers. As I pulled away from that house, I looked in the rear-view mirror. Mark and David were visible through the kitchen window, raising beer bottles in some kind of toast. They thought they'd won, thought they'd convinced their educated little brother to take the worthless land while they kept the gold mine. They thought they'd given me garbage. They had no idea they'd just handed me the key to everything. The 6-hour flight back to San Francisco was a blur. I don't remember the takeoff or the landing, just the weight of that cardboard box in the overhead bin. It felt heavier than just paper and rocks. It felt weighted with 30 years of my father's silence and my brother's contempt. Back in my apartment, the city lights glittering outside my window felt like a world away from the grit and gloom of Alaska. I placed the box on my kitchen table, the dust from my father's house smudging its clean surface. Every instinct told me to sleep, to put this whole humiliating day behind me. But my brother's laughter echoed in my ears, a soundtrack of their victory. I had to know. I had to know what they thought was so worthless. I ripped the brittle tape off the box. Inside, nestled amongst dozens of worn, water-stained journals, were rocks. Not just any rocks. Each one was a specimen, carefully labeled in Dad's heavy, all-caps handwriting with a date and a location. My hands bypassed the journals for a moment and closed around a heavy, bluish-gray stone labeled North Ravine, July 22nd. It was unusually dense. Cold. The weight of it in my palm felt wrong for its size. I pulled out the nearest notebook, a simple spiral-bound pad, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with my father's unmistakable script. The words pressed hard into the paper. My eyes scanned until they found the same date. July 22nd. Crusher jammed again. This damn blue devil rock. Hard as sin and heavy as lead. Not a speck of gold in it. Dumped 3 more barrels in the ravine. I froze. My analytical mind, the one that had been dormant with grief, suddenly flickered to life. Hard as sin, heavy as lead. These weren't the complaints of a gold miner. They were descriptions of physical properties. And in that instant, the crushing weight of humiliation in my chest didn't just shift. It ignited into something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously like a plan. That first night, I didn't sleep. Couldn't. My mind was racing with that single journal entry about the Blue Devil Rock. Hard as sin, heavy as lead. Those words kept looping in my head like a song you can't shake. By morning, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous, seeing patterns where there were none. My father had been a gold miner, not a geologist. He threw away what didn't shine. Simple as that. But I'm a data guy. And data guys don't ignore anomalies, even when common sense says we should. So I did what any rational person would do. I hired an independent environmental consultant to give me a remote assessment of my inherited junkyard. I sent him the property documents, the survey maps, everything I had. I told him I was considering selling it and needed to know what I was dealing with. His report arrived 3 days later. I opened the PDF at my desk, coffee in hand, expecting boring bureaucratic language about minor cleanup costs. What I got instead was a knife to the gut. The property is classified as brownfield industrial land. There are significant risks of soil and groundwater contamination, which represent legal liability for the owner. Any sale will be contingent upon completion of a Phase 2 environmental audit. Estimated remediation costs would likely exceed the market value of the land by a factor of 3 to 1. I read that last sentence again. And again. Remediation costs would exceed market value by 3 to 1. My brothers hadn't just screwed me. They'd hung an environmental time bomb around my neck with a bow on it. A literal money pit. The kind of liability that could follow me for years, maybe decades. The kind that could tank my credit, my career, everything I'd built. I sat there staring at my laptop screen, feeling that familiar weight pressing down on my chest. The weight of being the little brother who got played. Again. And that's when something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a throw things across the room way. It was quieter than that. More fundamental. It was a moment I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started getting curious instead. Because here's the thing. I'd spent years building predictive models, finding value in data that other people dismissed as noise. Market fluctuations that looked random to everyone else had patterns if you knew how to look. Anomalies weren't accidents. They were signals. And my father's junkyard was one massive anomaly. That night, I pulled out the journals again. All of them this time. I spread them across my living room floor in chronological order. 30 years of daily entries arranged like archaeological layers. The oldest ones had cover so faded you could barely read the dates. The newest still smelled faintly of diesel and tobacco. I wasn't looking for treasure. Not really. I was looking for my father, trying to understand a man who'd spent 3 decades in the Alaskan wilderness, documenting his days in these pages. What had he been thinking? What had he seen? The early journals were exactly what you'd expect. Weather reports, equipment maintenance, gold yields, the methodical recordings of a man building a life from scratch. May 3rd, clear skies. Sluice running smooth. 4.2 ounces today. Need to order new pump seals. June 18th, rain all week. Creek running high. Good flow through the boxes. 6.7 ounces. Best week this month. But then, around year 7, something changed. A new phrase started appearing. Infrequently at first, then with growing regularity. Blue Devil Rock. August 12th. Hit a vein of that blue gravel again. Been another screen. 3 hours of good mining lost to this garbage. September 4th. Damn Blue Devil is back. Heavy as lead but won't break clean. Gums up the whole operation. Hauled 5 loads to the North Ravine. I grabbed a highlighter and started marking every mention. Yellow for Blue Devil. Pink for descriptors. Green for locations. By 2 in the morning, my floor looked like a crime scene investigation board. And a pattern was emerging. A pattern that made my pulse quicken. The Blue Devil only appeared in entries about the northern section of the claim. Never the main vein where Mark and David were now working. Always the north. And my father's frustration with it was almost comically consistent. October 22nd. Crusher jammed solid. This blue stone doesn't crush. IT grinds the blades down. Harder than anything I've seen. Dumped it all in the ravine. Good riddance. December 1st. Tried to melt down a chunk of Blue Devil to see what's in it. Torch barely touched it. Whatever this stuff is, it's not normal rock. Still no gold. Waste of a day. May 14th. Screen bent again. This damn Blue Devil. Heavy as sin but hard as steel. Not a speck of gold in any of it. 3 more wheelbarrows to the ravine. I sat back on my heels, highlighter still in hand, and felt something click in my brain. My father had been filtering the world through a single lens. Gold. That was the signal he was searching for. Everything else was noise to be eliminated. But what he'd been calling noise, what he'd been cursing and throwing away for 30 years, had very specific properties. Extreme density. Check. Exceptional hardness. Check. High melting point. Check. Always found in the same geological location. Check. These weren't the characteristics of worthless rock. These were the characteristics of something rare. I pulled out my laptop and started searching. Heavy, dense rocks. Blue-gray minerals. High hardness. Resistant to heat. Found in Alaska. The search results made my hands start shaking. Rare earth elements. Strategic minerals. The kind of stuff that goes into smartphones, electric car batteries, wind turbines, military equipment. The kind of stuff that countries fight over. The kind of stuff that, until recently, came almost exclusively from China. And the kind of stuff that could look to an untrained eye like worthless blue-gray gravel. I opened another journal at random, this time from year 23. My father's handwriting was shakier now, the letters less precise. Age and arthritis creeping in. July 8th. North section still producing this blue junk. Why does it only show up here? Main vein stays clean and profitable. North just eats equipment and time. Should abandon it entirely, but hate to waste claim space. Should abandon it entirely. He'd almost done it. Almost given up on the north section completely. If he had, Mark and David might have inherited land with nothing on it but memories. Instead, he kept working it, kept getting frustrated with it, kept methodically hauling every ounce of Blue Devil to the ravine, kept accidentally creating the most detailed geological survey imaginable, because that's what his junkyard was. I could see it now. Every date-stamped journal entry was a data point. Every complaint about hauling Blue Devil to the North Ravine was a coordinate on a map. He'd been documenting the exact location, density, and extent of a mineral deposit for 3 decades without realizing it. My father had been writing the answer in his journals every single night, and nobody had known to ask the question. I didn't sleep that night either, or the next. I was running on coffee, adrenaline, and something that felt a lot like vindication. I scanned every single journal page. All 30 years. My scanner ran hot, the cooling fan whirring constantly as I fed it page after page of my father's blocky handwriting. Then I wrote a script, a text analysis algorithm that could parse handwritten text, identify keywords, extract dates and locations. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to find patterns. I fed it phrases: blue devil, blue gravel, blue stone, north ravine, north section, hauled, dumped, heavy, hard. And then I let it run. The laptop fan kicked into high gear. Processing, analyzing, thousands of entries, decades of data. And slowly, pixel by pixel, a map began to form on my screen. Each mention of Blue Devil became a point of light. Each complaint about hauling it to ravine became a coordinate. The dates gave me time depth. The descriptions gave me density estimates. My father's frustration, quantified and mapped, started to reveal something extraordinary. The North Ravine wasn't just a junkyard. It was sitting directly on top of a massive geological formation. And for 30 years, my father had been carefully, methodically, furiously documenting its exact boundaries. I zoomed in on the map. The cluster of points was dense, concentrated, the kind of distribution that geologists dream about. This wasn't scattered deposits. This was a vein, a big one. Then I cross-referenced it with the property lines from the inheritance documents, the ones I'd signed without reading. And I started laughing, actually laughing out loud in my empty apartment at 3 a.m, because the property line that divided the main claim from the North Ravine ran right along the fault line. Mark and David had taken the profitable gold operation that was already running dry. I could see it in Dad's later journals. Yields dropping year after year, equipment failing, costs rising. But I'd gotten the liability, the cleanup nightmare, the environmental bomb, and also, apparently, one of the largest undiscovered rare earth mineral deposits in North America. I sat there in the blue glow of my laptop screen, looking at that map, really looking at it, seeing not just the data points, but what they meant. My father had spent 30 years cursing these rocks, calling them devils, throwing them away, never knowing what they actually were. And my brothers had spent one afternoon smirking at me, convinced they'd pulled off the con of the century. Neither of them knew. Nobody knew. Just me. And this map glowing on my screen like a treasure chart written in complaints and frustration. I took a screenshot, then another. Then I backed up the entire analysis to 3 different cloud services because I wasn't about to lose this. My hands were trembling as I typed, not from exhaustion, from something else entirely. You know that feeling when you suddenly understand something that changes everything? When reality shifts and you see the world completely differently than you did 5 minutes ago. I was staring at 30 years of my father's work. 30 years of data he'd collected without meaning to. A geological survey more thorough than anything a mining company could have commissioned, hidden in the daily complaints of a stubborn man who only wanted to find gold. He'd been sitting on a fortune the entire time, and he died never knowing it. But I knew, and I had the receipts. Every single page documented, dated, and mapped. The crushing weight that had been pressing down on my chest since that meeting in Alaska wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something different. Something harder, something with purpose. My brothers thought they'd handed me garbage and kept the gold mine. They had no idea they'd done exactly the opposite. I looked at that glowing map on my screen one more time. The blue points clustered so densely in the north section, they almost formed a solid shape. Boundaries clearly defined by 30 years of meticulous documentation. A deposit so large it would take decades to extract. And it was mine. All mine. Legally, undeniably mine. I had the signed documents to prove it. The sun was starting to rise over San Francisco, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ironic, considering. My father had spent 30 years cursing what he thought was worthless rock. My brothers had spent one afternoon laughing at what they thought was a worthless brother. They were both wrong. I looked at the map one last time. A treasure chart written in complaints and frustration. It wasn't just data anymore. It was leverage. It was power. It was justice. And I knew exactly what my next call was going to be. That next call wasn't to a lawyer. It wasn't to my brothers. It was to a geological consulting firm in Anchorage that specialized in discrete environmental assessments. I couldn't risk going back to Alaska myself. Not yet. Mark and David would smell something if their little brother suddenly showed interest in his junkyard. So I hired professionals who knew how to be invisible. The cover story was simple. I was a potential buyer interested in purchasing an adjacent property for development. Could they conduct a preliminary environmental survey of the surrounding area, including soil composition analysis? Totally routine, totally legal, totally boring paperwork that wouldn't raise any red flags. They took core samples from 6 different locations across the North Ravine. Professional, clinical, by the book. The invoice made my eyes water, but this was the price of certainty. You don't bet your future on a hunch and a bunch of old journals, no matter how compelling the data looks. I didn't send those samples to some local testing facility where word might leak. I shipped them to a specialized laboratory in Germany that handles rare earth analysis for mining corporations, the kind of place that signs ironclad NDAs before they even open a box. 2 weeks later, the results came back. I was at my desk in San Francisco when the email arrived. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I clicked it open. The report was dense with technical language, geological terminology, percentage compositions, but the executive summary was crystal clear. The samples contained significant concentrations of neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and several other rare earth elements. The grade and purity were exceptional. Preliminary estimates suggested this could be one of the richest rare earth deposits in North America. I read that line 3 times. One of the richest deposits in North America. Just sitting there under 30 years of rusted pickaxes and broken dreams. But knowing you have treasure and actually getting it out of the ground are 2 very different things. I needed capital. Real capital. The kind of money that makes Silicon Valley seed funding look like pocket change. So I didn't go to the venture capitalists in San Francisco. This wasn't some app that needed a cute pitch deck and a hockey stick growth chart. This was heavy industry, strategic resources, geopolitical chess. I flew to Houston. The private equity firm I met with didn't have a flashy website or a trendy office with ping-pong tables. They had a conference room with mahogany furniture and maps of global supply chains on the walls. These were the people who financed oil fields and lithium mines and natural gas pipelines. The serious money. I didn't pitch them a dream. I pitched them a fait accompli. A pre-certified asset with de-risk variables. I showed them my father's journals alongside the German laboratory results. I showed them satellite imagery of the property. I showed them the inheritance documents proving clear title. Then I showed them something else. Market data. China controlled over 90% of global rare earth production. Every electric car battery, every wind turbine, every advanced weapon system depended on elements that flowed through a single geopolitical choke point. The military, the tech sector, the entire green energy transition was vulnerable. What I was offering them wasn't just profit. It was strategic independence, a domestic supply chain, the kind of asset that made you friends in very high places. They funded me in 72 hours. $18 million for initial development. Another $50 million on standby for full-scale operations. They didn't even try to negotiate me down. When you're offering them a chance to rewrite the rare earth market, $18 million is a rounding error. I incorporated immediately North Star Legacy Minerals. The name was deliberate. Legacy for my father. North Star because I was about to become the guiding light that every rare earth buyer in America would navigate toward. The equipment I brought to Alaska wasn't your grandfather's mining operation. No diesel-belching bulldozers. No old men with pickaxes. I contracted with a Swedish firm that specialized in sustainable extraction, electric excavators, so quiet you could have a conversation standing next to them. Robotic sorting systems that could identify mineral composition in real time. Everything designed to minimize environmental impact while maximizing efficiency. Because here's the thing. I knew that Junkyard was an environmental disaster. The consultant's report had made that brutally clear. So Phase 1 wasn't mining. It was the largest voluntary environmental cleanup Alaska had seen in a decade. We brought in specialized crews, hazmat certified. Every piece of rusted equipment got cataloged, removed, and properly recycled. Every pool of leaked oil got remediated. We didn't just meet environmental standards. We exceeded them, set new ones. And my brothers watched the whole thing like it was performance art. Every evening, like clockwork, Mark and David would drive over the fence line between our properties. They'd park their beat-up pickup, crack open beers, and watch my crews work. I could hear them laughing from 100 yards away. Look at this guy, spending millions to clean up garbage we gave him for free. This is the funniest thing I've ever seen. City boy doesn't understand. That's not how you make money up here. You dig, you extract, you move on. You don't polish rocks. I bet he's already underwater on this. Probably borrowed against his fancy San Francisco condo to fund this circus. Their laughter carried on the cold air. Every night, same routine, same jokes, same absolute certainty that they were watching their little brothers self-destruct in spectacular fashion. I never corrected them, never explained, just smiled and waved occasionally, which only made them laugh harder. The cleanup took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of watching decades of junk get systematically removed, sorted, and hauled away. Old engine blocks, collapsed sluice boxes, endless tangles of rusted cable. That Ford pickup bed from the 70s that had been sitting there so long it had become part of the landscape. And then, on a Tuesday evening in late September, we lifted that truck bed out of the ground. The earth beneath it caught the late afternoon sun. The ground was exposed for the first time in God knows how many years. And it wasn't the dull brown of regular dirt. It wasn't the gray of typical rock. It had a distinct bluish tint to it, almost like someone had mixed indigo paint into the soil. The color was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. My brothers were at their usual spot by the fence. I watched them watching the excavation. They were laughing about something, probably making another joke about my expensive cleanup operation. They didn't notice the color. To them, it was just more dirt under more junk. They thought they were watching me waste money on a cleanup job. I knew I was watching the wrapping come off a gift. That night, I authorized Phase 2, full extraction operations. The robotic sorters went into overdrive. The quiet hum of electric excavators filled the ravine. We weren't being subtle anymore. We were mining. And that's when I made the call to my PR team. The story broke simultaneously in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes on a Wednesday morning. I'd given them everything. The journals, the lab results, the inheritance documents, the whole narrative arc from funeral to fortune. The headlines were brutal. Data analyst turns worthless inheritance into rare earth empire. Brothers give away billion-dollar deposit thinking it was Junkyard. Silicon Valley analyst outsmarts Alaska gold miners with father's hidden journals. The articles didn't just report the discovery. They told the whole story. How I'd been given the Junkyard as a consolation prize. How my brothers had kept the profitable gold claim. How they'd laughed at me for taking the environmental liability off their hands. And how I'd turned their mockery into the largest domestic rare earth operation in the western United States. The story went viral. CNBC ran it. Bloomberg picked it up. Reddit had 3 different threads on the front page. The comment sections were savage. Imagine being so greedy you accidentally give away $1 billion. Those brothers are going to see that Junkyard every time they close their eyes for the rest of their lives. This is what happens when people who work with their hands try to outsmart someone who works with their brain. My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. Unknown numbers. I ignored them all, but I knew who it was. They showed up at my site office 3 days later. Both of them. Mark's face was the color of a stop sign. David looked like he'd aged 10 years in 72 hours. They didn't knock, just barged in like they owned the place. Like they owned me. Mark's voice was shaking. This is fraud. You knew. You had to have known when you signed those papers. We're going to sue you for everything. David was right behind him. We're family, Jack. You can't do this to family. We'll split it. 60-40. That's fair. That's more than fair considering we're the ones who actually know how to run a mining operation. I let them talk. Let them rage and plead and threaten. When they finally ran out of steam, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a copy of the inheritance agreement. The one they'd prepared. The one with their signatures and mine. I slid it across the desk. Here's your signature. And here's mine. You drew the property line. You made the offer. I accepted. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. The deal is closed. Mark's hand crumpled the paper. You knew. You had to know. I knew what was in my father's journals. I knew how to read data. I knew how to ask the right questions. You knew how to laugh at your little brother. We all knew what we knew. I stood up. Now, please leave my property. I have work to do. They left, but I knew this wasn't over. People like Mark and David don't accept defeat gracefully. They double down. They take risks. They make desperate moves. And desperate people make fatal mistakes. 3 months later, I got the call I'd been half expecting. There'd been an accident at the main claim. A structural collapse in one of the primary extraction tunnels. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but the damage was catastrophic. Turns out those rotted support beams I'd noticed during the funeral, the ones with daylight visible through the wood, had finally given up completely. Years of deferred maintenance and aggressive extraction had weakened the entire tunnel system. The collapse wasn't just a collapse. It ruptured something else. A settling pond they'd been using for tailings. The toxic runoff that they'd been storing in violation of about 15 different environmental regulations. The contamination spread into the groundwater. Fast. The EPA showed up within 48 hours. Then the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. Then the lawyers. So many lawyers. The fines were astronomical. The kind of numbers that have multiple commas. The remediation requirements were even worse. They'd have to excavate and treat thousands of cubic yards of contaminated soil. Rebuild the entire water treatment system. Monitor the groundwater for years. The cost estimates range from $30 to $50 million. My brothers didn't have $30 million. They didn't have $3 million. Their entire operation was mortgaged to the hilt, and the collapse had destroyed their ability to generate revenue. They were done. My legal team reached out with an offer. North Star Legacy Minerals would purchase the main claim for $1. In exchange, we'd assume all environmental liability and handle the cleanup. $1 for property they'd fought so hard to keep. The gold mine they'd been so proud to inherit. They signed the papers in a lawyer's office in Anchorage. I wasn't there. Didn't need to be. Didn't want to be. This wasn't about gloating. It was just business. The consolidation of the two properties took another 4 months. Environmental remediation, infrastructure integration, systems optimization. But by the following spring, North Star Legacy Minerals controlled the entire family claim, united for the first time in 3 generations. Last week, I flew back to Alaska, not for business this time, just to see it. The property that had torn my family apart, and then brought it back together under one banner. I stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The old main claim section was still scarred from the cleanup, but native grasses were starting to return. The North Ravine, my junkyard, was now a state-of-the-art extraction facility. Clean, efficient, profitable beyond my wildest projections. I brought one of my father's journals with me, not the one with the Blue Devil complaints. An earlier one, from his first year in Alaska, when he was young and everything was still possible. I flipped through the pages until I found the entry I was looking for. May 15th. His handwriting was neater then, before arthritis made every letter struggle. Spent all day chasing glitter. The old-timers laugh at me. They say you don't get rich digging for what shines. You get rich when you find value in the tons of what everyone else throws over their shoulder. I read that line 3 times. My father had known. Maybe not consciously. Maybe not in a way he could articulate. But somewhere deep down, he'd understood the fundamental truth. Value isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's hidden in the noise, in the complaints, in the things people curse and discard because they don't fit the pattern they're looking for. He'd been telling me the secret the entire time, writing it down every night for 30 years. I just hadn't been listening. But I was listening now, and so was the entire rare earth market. I closed the journal and looked out over the valley. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and blue, the same colors my father had spent his whole life chasing and cursing. He'd never gotten rich from his mine, never struck the big vein he dreamed about, died thinking he'd spent 30 years moving rocks for modest returns. But he'd left me something more valuable than gold. He left me a map written in frustration, a treasure chart drawn in complaints, a fortune built from everything he thought was worthless. And he'd taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. Sometimes the real treasure isn't what you're digging for. It's what you're throwing away.